So, just a little note about the speaker. It says Abdullah al Andalusi is flying up from London, England. He's an international speaker, thinker, and intellectual activist for Islam and Muslim affairs. His work involves explaining and demonstrating by rational argument the intellectual proofs for the Islamic belief system, and promoting the Islamic way of life and Islamic solutions for contemporary problems. He has spoken in community centers, universities, colleges, and numerous appearances on various programs on TV channels, including the BBC, ITV, BBC Arabic, BBC Radio, Al Jazeera, Press TV, Islam Channel, and Iqra TV. He also has engaged in a number of debates with atheists, secularists, agnostics, liberals, and Christians on a variety of topics from theology to political philosophy. In 2009, he co-founded the Public Discussion Forum, the Muslim Debate Initiative, a forum that promotes open dialogue and critical debate between thinkers, academics, politicians, and public speakers of all backgrounds. So without further ado, please put your hands together for Ustaz Abdullah al Andalusi.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salam Nabi Kareem Muhammad wa ali tayyibin wa sahbihi salihin. I greet you all with the Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace and blessing of God be upon you all. I'd like to thank the University of Calgary for their kind hosting of this event, and for the United Islam Awareness Week project for the series of events, and for their gracious hospitality, and for all you for attending this event. And of course you might have seen other events in this series. And it's always pleasant coming back to Canada. I always view it as the more polite and friendly version of the USA. So it's always good. It's also nice to taste real maple syrup and not the kind of fake stuff they sell us in Europe, claiming it's maple syrup, just sugar syrup or something, with a maple leaf sticker on the bottle. So it's always nice. It's the first time I'm actually in Calgary. I've been to Calgary Airport, passed by, but it's his first time in Calgary, and I heard there was a snowstorm to greet me. So that was quite cool, actually. I kind of faced the real prospect of being buried under snow as we were driving on the highway, and so that was really quite interesting. I had to kind of refresh my survival skills. And anyway, so kind of today's discussion is really going to be about, I suppose, misconceptions that you've heard about Islam. But I would kind of really want to frame, before we discuss the misconceptions and go through the probably endless list of misconceptions, I'd like to maybe discuss a little bit about why there are misconceptions, why there would be misconceptions, and about Islam, and about maybe other belief systems and other ideas. Now, first and foremost, I would say that the misconceptions against Islam, and people often talk about we're living in a post-truth age, where truth doesn't matter so much, it's more rhetoric, it's more popularist emotion. Well, I'd argue that actually, as the Tanakh says, there's nothing new under the sun. And I think humans have always, to an extent, different times, different societies have been dominated by what we call propaganda, or what we call just misinformation campaigns. So, for example, even as far back as the Roman Empire, sorry, not the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic before it became an empire, in order to get their citizens to go to war, they would regularly make lies about different neighboring tribes and nations, and say these are a threat to us, these are barbarians, we have to civilize them, or either we fight them or they're going to invade us. And the Roman Republic was the period of time in kind of Roman history was the most aggressive time, or one of the most aggressive time in Roman history, was while it was a republic, even before it became an empire, transformed into an empire. So we see that the idea of moving populations to agree to certain foreign policies and certain aggressive actions or misrepresentations of those who are foreign has been long-standing. Even the term barbarian, which I think comes from a Greek word, which kind of comes from onomatopoeic, barbar, meaning that the foreign language of these foreigners sounds like barbar, so barbarian. It's just like we don't know what they're saying. It's kind of strange language they're speaking. So, likewise, it's not surprising that we'll see a lot of misconceptions against civilizations outside of, you could say, traditional Western Christendom. And I say Western Christendom as opposed to Eastern Christendom, which the Eastern Roman Empire, the Greek Orthodox Church, that was a different civilization. In fact, Western Christendom even viewed Eastern Christendom as a different kind of people, even different kind of Christianity. For example, the Northern Crusades, which were launched in, I believe, the 15th century, the 14th and 15th century, in Eastern Europe, pitted Catholics on a crusade against heathens, were killing Eastern Orthodox Christians for enforcing them into Catholic Christianity, but calling them heathens, even though despite their fellow Christians, and they believe in pretty much most of the same doctrines. So likewise, the understanding of the concept of Islam, the kind of misinformation has gone back since that time, and I kind of want to address maybe some historical misconceptions of Islam. Now, from the perspective of Eastern Christendom, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, not the Eastern Roman Empire, which survived until the 15th century, it was perceived that the people of the Christendom, of Western Christendom, were on a mission to spread monotheism, to spread religion to the heathens, to the pagans, to the polytheists. So when they encountered Muslims coming from the Middle East, they didn't know how to process this, other than to say, well, if they're not Christian and not following our religion, and they're following a different religion, they must be heathens, they must be polytheists, and they must be idol worshippers, they must be worshipping a pantheon of pagan gods and statues and kind of fetishes and and idols. This is what they must be doing. And when they heard that Muslims believed in a personality called Prophet Muhammad, it was interpreted in Western Christendom that Muslims probably worshipped Prophet Muhammad as a god, or as an incarnate god in the flesh, which all of that is completely false. But more, I think one of the tropes that survives even till today, which you probably encounter in certain, should we say, kind of hawkish, right-wing discourses in southern USA, Southern Baptist kind of discourses about Islam. As we see a very common trope that Muslims are somehow worship a moon god, because the symbol of Islam appears to be a crescent moon and a five-pointed star. So let's deal with that right off the bat. In the Quran, which we believe is the literal word of God, as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad and for mankind, we believe God says, "And from among his signs are the night and the day, and the sun and the moon. Prostrate not to the sun nor to the moon, but prostrate to God who created them, if you really worship him." So right off the bat, the Quran is quite explicitly saying, don't worship the sun or the moon, worship he who created them, if you truly worship God. So the idea that we worship a moon god is fallacious. But also people get confused by the word Allah, and they say, oh, this is this really strange, name for a deity that Muslims worship, Allah. I don't know what this Allah is, I worship God. Allah, I don't recognize this. Well, there's an irony here. You see, if we were somehow able to go back in time and bring Jesus into the modern age, or into this year, and he heard, alayhi salam, he heard the Arabic word Allah, and he heard the Germanic rooted word God from Gott, he wouldn't recognize the Germanic word, the English word you're using, but he'd recognize the Arabic word. And why is that? Because Arabic is a Semitic language. And in all Semitic languages in the region, the word for God is pretty much spelled exactly the same. In Hebrew, it's Eloh. In Aramaic, the language of Jesus, it is Elah. In Syriac, it's Allah. And in Arabic, of course, it's Allah. And the spelling is exactly the same. It's, I suppose, A-L-H in all these languages. It's the word for God in Semitic languages. It's quite common. And this is interesting. And I don't know if any of you saw this this film called Passion of the Christ, which they tried to do this film in Aramaic to make it more authentic. The actor who is meant to be portraying Jesus, if you listen to what he's saying when he talks, and you just wait for the subtitles to tell you when he's mentioning the word God. Listen out. You'll see him here. You'll see him say Allah when he's referring to God. So Allah is not some strange personal name for a foreign god. It's just the word for God in Arabic. Arab Christians use it. Arabic-speaking Jews use it. It's the same word, and it's pretty much the same word in all the other languages. The only variant is probably the pronunciation by the accent of the different languages, but it's spelled virtually exactly the same. So Allah is not some foreign God. It is the same God that of the Jews, the same God of the Christians. And this really brings us to kind of Islamic theology. The idea that somehow Muslims believe that God chose only 1400 years ago to tell mankind about the truth. That for thousands of years, or millions of years even maybe, that humans have been around, that God only chose 1400 years ago to reveal the truth. But that's false. In Islam, as Muslims, we believe that Islam is merely the latest reiteration of a universal and very old truth that was revealed to all nations at various points in history. It's the same message, and it's a consistent message. And therefore, as Muslims, we believe in Prophet Jesus. We affirm that he's the Messiah. We love Jesus. And you're thinking, what? How can you love Jesus? You're not Christian. But he's a prophet of God. He's a messenger, and we affirm that he's the Messiah. It shares a similar root in Arabic from masaha, which means to kind of anoint with water or pass water over. Anoint. That's what Messiah means, to be anointed. And it's the same in Arabic as well, because the languages are, again, very similar, Hebrew and Arabic. So we affirm this, and we affirm that he came to the lost sheep of Israel, as the New Testament puts it. We don't necessarily believe in the full accuracy of the historical records regarding him, because obviously that we know, and many Bible scholars can tell you, there was a lot of we don't know how to authenticate which particular gospels and which of these things, and that might cause variation, but I'll get to that. But generally speaking, the basic message of Jesus, which I still think is you can access if you look carefully in the New Testament, and the message of Moses, which is in the Tanakh, which Christians call the Old Testament, is generally the same and quite consistent. So the Quran summates this. In a way, the Quran kind of tells Muslims how to explain our belief to those of our predecessors in Revelation, Jews and Christians. So in the Quran it says, God tells us, say, we believe in God and the revelation given to us, and to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes, and the message given to Moses and Jesus, and that given to all prophets from their Lord. We make no distinction between any of them, and it is unto him that we surrender ourselves. So what the Quran is saying is that, in essence, if you think, Muslims, they believe in Prophet Muhammad, so that they must love him the best, and all the prophets are just relegated. No, it says we make no distinction between them. We love Jesus as much as we love the Prophet Muhammad. We don't discriminate or play favorites. These are all prophets of God, messengers of God. And when we see Jesus being insulted or disparaged in various satirical programs or cartoons, or people making just gratuitous insults because they think it's clever or funny, or somehow benefits the pursuit of truth merely to disparage rather than producing a valid criticism or argument, we are hurt as much as if it was the Prophet Muhammad, happening to the Prophet Muhammad. I suppose because Muslims are we're kind of used to, in the West, being in a minority, and seeing as the Christians in the West seem to have accepted that Jesus can be insulted, and they just kind of ignore it. It's Muslims sometimes feel a bit muted as to kind of raising our objection when we see Jesus being disparaged. But some Christians do speak out and do peaceful protests and demonstrations. And I think if they do peaceful protest demonstrations, then it doesn't limit people's freedom of speech just because you're doing a peaceful protest or demonstration. It's a fulfillment of freedom of speech, that if someone wants to insult, you should have the right, at the very least, just to say, I object to this. Right? It's not, tolerance doesn't require you to be silent. So as Muslims, we hate that Jesus is disparaged and insulted, because we love him like we love the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But I will mention some differences, slight differences and similarities. So in Islam, the ideas or the theology of Muslims, we believe in one God who is not like creation. He's created, he's not limited, he's not finite, he doesn't look like a man, doesn't look like the sun or the moon or a volcano or on an island or any type of created thing that you could imagine, or finite or limited thing, or thing that's within time or space. This we believe is not God, cannot be God. God is beyond, he transcends these things. And when we say, when I use the word he, just in case Trudeau's in the room and will correct me, we don't mean that God is a male. It's just it's just a word we use to, instead of saying it, because it implies it could be inanimate or not without personality. So there's no such thing as in Arabic anyway, as a genderless term for something that has a personality, so to speak. When I say personality, that has will. So don't interpret that we mean that God is male. God is beyond human gender. And we would never worship a God that has a gender anyway, because why would God need to reproduce or procreate? It's ridiculous. So we'd say that anyone who believes, even if you don't have a religion, even if you say that you don't follow any particular religion or you're still searching, but you believe in God who is unlimited, uncreated, and transcends all finite things, is beyond these finiteness and limited characteristics and finitude, you believe in the same God we do. The same God. And if you pray to that God, you pray to the same God we do. And there is only one God. There is no others. There could not be any others. If there was more than one God, then they would limit each other, and then they wouldn't be infinite. It would be finite, because they'd both be sharing the same amount of power, and then who could destroy the other, and so on and so forth. So, rationally speaking, as well as what I view as consistent revelation, there is only one God. And this is the message of Unitarian Christianity, and the message of Judaism, and the message of many other religions. And we often find that if you look at other religions throughout history, you'll see aspects of commonality between them, which we believe is because originally every nation received a prophet from God saying the same message, but over time humans embellished it, changed it, corrupted it. Instead of trying to get closer to God, metaphorically so to speak, they brought God more closer to them, to look like them, act like them, because it was easier to interact with a God with a human face or with an animal face than a God that you couldn't see. So this is the message of Islam, and this is why we believe that God constantly reiterates the same message to mankind, to ensure all mankind has access to the same message. The only differences between Islam and let's say Trinitarian Christianity is generally minor. I mean, if you look at Jesus' ministry, and I'm going to just do this very briefly before going to the main misconceptions, but I think it's important that you know where the differences are rather than just also the similarities and busting misconceptions. So while Jewish theology and Islamic theology are virtually identical, the idea of atonement, repentance, sincerely repenting to God for your sins, being forgiven by God, because if your repentance is accepted and is sincere, worshipping God, ritualized worships, all these aspects are exactly, almost virtually identical between Jewish theology and Islamic theology. The only variance is that as Muslims we don't believe that Jesus is literally the incarnate, is God incarnate in the flesh, like he is literally God incarnate. This is where we disagree, and this is where Islam views its mission is to kind of reiterate the teachings of Jesus. And if you look at, and I would argue that you can see glimmers of this in the New Testament. Actually, very clear glimmers of this in the New Testament. For example, when someone approached Jesus, I mean, this is according to the New Testament account, but if you subscribe to the New Testament, at least listen to this. So someone approaches Jesus and said, "A good teacher, what must I do to, earn the kingdom of heaven?" So Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? There is no one good but God." So the person then adjusts where he says, "Okay, teacher, what must I do to earn the kingdom of heaven?" And so Jesus asked him, "Do you know the commandments? Do you follow these commandments?" And the guy responded, "I've followed these commandments since I was a boy. I haven't broken them." And then it says Jesus looked to him and loved him. We also see a parable that is alleged that Jesus said in the New Testament, which I think was actually very interesting. It was the parable of the king and the servant. A king or a leader of some kind had a servant who owed him a lot of money. He had lent a lot of money to this servant. And so the servant comes to the king, the time's up, the deadline for that repayment is come, and he summons this servant and says, "You pay back what you owe." And the person begs the king, "I don't have the money, give me more time, I promise I will pay you that money." And then the king decides to forgive his servant that debt. But that servant had his own servant who owed him money, who owed that servant money. And then when the time came to pay, the manservant begged the other guy, saying, look, I don't have the money, give me more time. But the man said, no, you have to pay off now, and if you don't, I'll send you to debtor's prison until you do. When the king heard of this, he summoned his servant and said, when you had a big debt to me, I forgave you. But when your servant had a smaller debt to you, you didn't forgive. And so now you are going to pay me what you owe. And then it is narrated that Jesus said, this is what my Father will do to you. He will punish you if you do not forgive each other. And he will forgive you if you forgive each other. So forgive others if you want to be forgiven, which parallels a few verses of the Quran saying the same thing. If you want to be forgiven, forgive others. The same message. No discussion about a blood atonement or blood sacrifice required, or to believe that Jesus died on the cross for your sins, and that is how you get redeemed. No, it is repent to God, God will forgive you, forgive others, and hope for God's forgiveness to you. Now, I won't do it in that. I'm just here to highlight the differences. I'm not really going to make an argument that this is what the strongest interpretation of the New Testament and so on. That's probably for a debate, and it wouldn't be fair for me to make such a claim without having someone who represents that side also on the same platform. As I always say, it's easy for one person who's unchallenged to sound convincing on a platform. So take what I've said merely as information as to the Islamic position, and what parts of the New Testament Muslims feel resonate with our teachings. So take it just as that, and maybe in a future discussion, or maybe an amicable debate, and you can have amicable debates, they do have in my organisation, Muslim Debate Initiative, we do it all the time. We have great friendships with our opponents, our intellectual debate opponents, because we're all here to show the truth, and debate's a great way of doing that, and to allow the audience to make a more informed decision. Anyway, so that's really the substantive difference, and of course Muslims don't believe in the concept of a Trinity, so we don't believe that God can be divided all into three components or three persons, or has three different wills. We believe God is indivisible and fundamental, and that's another difference between Islam and Trinitarian Christianity. I know that the doctrine of the Trinity has had a lot of philosophical discourse and explanation by philosophers over the Christian philosophers over the years. So I'm just telling you we have a difference, but if you want to know a bit more about the Trinity, at least please do your own research yourself. I'm just here to tell you where the difference is like. We don't accept that God has three different wills or three different persons. We believe that God is indivisible. Now, I'll get to not a misconception, and then I'm going to get to what I call the big ticket misconceptions, which you probably hear in the media. So there is a perception that Islam is somehow austere and harsh and uncaring and uncompromising, a rigid law system that Muslims, if they even drop a single crumb, they are somehow going to be eternal reprobates in hell, which is obviously false. And I'm going to discuss them. I want to present him the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad himself. So a person approached the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and asked him what aspect of Islam was best. What was the best aspect of Islam? And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, feeding the hungry and saying peace to those you know and those you don't know. Like we give salam, wishing peace or saying peace to those you know and those you don't know. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ also said, do you know what is better than charity and fasting and prayer? It is keeping peace and good relations between people, as quarrels and bad feelings destroy mankind. That was what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said. The Prophet also said, kindness is a mark of faith, and whoever is not kind has no faith. So the Prophet Muhammad taught Muslims that kindness is a mark of faith, and if you as a Muslim are not kind, then you don't have any faith. The Prophet Muhammad also said, whoever is kind, God will be kind to him. Therefore be kind to man on earth who is in heaven. He who is in heaven will show mercy on you. We also see another narration where the Prophet Muhammad gave a testimony, by him in whose hand my soul is, you will not enter paradise unless you believe, and you will not truly believe unless you love each other. So this is what the Prophet Muhammad taught. We also see that the Prophet Muhammad taught God is gentle and loves gentleness in all things. These are the teachings of Islam: mercy, compassion. Virtually every chapter of the Quran begins with the appellation, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. And one of the names for God is what? The most gracious, most merciful, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. Almost every single chapter of the Quran begins with naming God by his name, the most gracious, the most merciful. That is the God of Islam, not some austere, distant God that punishes you from afar for the slightest infraction. In fact, there's a narration of Hadith Qudsi, I believe, a narration narrated by the Prophet Muhammad, who taught us that if we didn't commit sin, if we were sinless, God would have destroyed us and created a creature that could sin and did sin, so that then it would repent and ask forgiveness, and God could forgive it. This is the teachings of Islam. That in Islam we believe God knows we're going to sin. Doesn't want us to sin, of course, but knows that through sinning and repentance, this is another worship of God, a way to access mercy, a way to access forgiveness. So repentance is another aspect of worshipping God. And if humans didn't sin, we couldn't have that avenue of worshipping God. So Islam is not an austere religion. Islam is not a harsh religion. It's a religion of kindness and mercy. But unfortunately, that's not what you see in the media, and we'll get to that. I also want to briefly go to I suppose the next big misconception. You'll find it a lot in this discourse, that Islam oppresses women, and you'll see this discussion used to justify limiting the rights and freedoms, especially of minorities, in the name of freeing and liberating them. So the argument is that women who have to wear the headscarf, who have to, from Islamic ordinances, are somehow oppressed. And women who choose to wear the face covering, they're somehow being forced into doing so. No one did any surveys. No one did any questionnaires of these women. No one really even cared what their opinion it was. It was asserted, and then rules were made based on that assertion. And when it was brought up, and this is, I know this is in the kind of francophone parts of Canada, this kind of discussion occurred, but it occurred in France first. When it was rebutted that, well, how do we know for certain if women are being forced to wear the head coverings? And you can please feel free to ask women here that do have head coverings whether they're being forced to or not. But when it was brought that, well, how do we know if women who wear the face covering or women who have headscarves they're being forced to or not? It was us, well, it's irrelevant, because even if they choose to wear the head covering or the face covering, they are oppressing themselves. So they are oppressing their own individuality, because as we all know, individuality can only be expressed by buying mass-produced fashion told to you in fashion magazines and sold by the millions. That's how you express your individuality. And this is really the issue. So let's kind of get down to it. So first and foremost, Islam gave women the right to own their own property. And you might think, well, that's obvious. I mean, why does that need to be mentioned? Well, it needs to be mentioned because only 100 or so years ago, Europe had the concept of couverture in its law systems, whereby if a woman's property either belonged to her father, the head of the family, or when she got married, her property was automatically assigned to her husband. So that if a woman was divorced, she would lose all her property because it was already assigned to her husband. I mean, some could argue, well, to be fair, if she committed crimes, the husband would be held accountable for it. But she still couldn't own her own property or have the right of disposal over her own affairs. It was called couverture, and this existed into Victorian times. This is way after the Enlightenment era of Western civilization, Europe and so on and so forth. Whereas 1400 years ago, it was just a given that women could own their own property, and when women get married, that does not become the property of the husband. She controls all her property still. And that must be also viewed in context to the next right that she has, which is the right to maintenance and support from her husband, whether the husband likes it or not. The man must provide for his wife. Now, of course, I always say that there could be exceptions, but the exceptions resolve themselves. If a woman's rich and she wants to marry a guy who doesn't have much money, or is unemployed, or has no income, and she voluntarily decides to waiver her right to demand maintenance, well, that resolves itself. If she decides to waiver her right, she can do it. But if she doesn't decide to waiver her right, then the man has to provide for her food, clothing, shelter. That's just the material rights. There are the non-material rights. I'll get to the non-tangible rights, like affection, mercy, intimacy, and so on. But let's discuss just the material rights first. So the man must spend his property, from his property, on his wife, looking after her, ensuring that she wants for nothing. But she keeps her own property. Also, we see that Islam changed the dowry system. Now, usually in pagan Arabia, or at least amongst many cultures around the world, when a woman gets married to a man, the woman pays the man, or the woman's family pays the man's family, a dowry, a gift. And so in India, for example, in Hindu culture, that's an accepted practice. But some people have noticed that I'm not being critical of Hindu culture. I'm just talking about now. Some people have noticed there are consequences or ramifications to this. Some people have noticed that there's a high degree of female infanticide in these countries, and it was raised that this might be due to the fact that many people who are poor and have daughters, they don't know how to deal with daughters. They don't know how to marry them off, because it costs money to marry your daughters off to a suitor. And so many people prefer not to have daughters. In fact, even in 7th century pagan Arabia, it was viewed as a great shame if your firstborn child was a female. And what they used to do, I'm not sure exactly how widespread it is. I speculate it was probably more about on the noble classes of the nobility of pagan Arabia. But what they would do is they would bury their daughters alive. As soon as they ascertained the gender, they would bury, because the parents probably didn't want to kill or stab or their baby, but they would make a hole in the ground, put the baby in, and bury them alive. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ spoke out against this very vociferously. There's verses of the Quran that give amazing invectives against this, saying that on the Day of Judgment, the young infant will say, "For what crime was I killed? For what crime was I murdered?" And the Quran says, "Do not kill your children for fear of want. God will provide for you and them." But Islam also did something else. It reversed the dowry system. So now any man that wants to get married to a woman, or vice versa, the man has to pay the marriage gift. The man has to pay the dowry, not the woman, not the woman's family. So now it changed it. It made people not view women as a financial burden, but rather that something to be honored by giving a gift, something to be cherished by. The dowry isn't the price. Before anyone argues or thinks it, the dowry isn't the price of the woman. It's just a gift. People give gifts, you know. Like if someone might give you a pair of socks on Christmas, it doesn't mean that your value is a pair of socks. And you could be traded for that. Be quite cheap as well. So this is what the Prophet Muhammad instituted. And of course, very basic things, such as Islam gave women the right to choose who they want to get married to. Women can't be compelled into marriage, and she must give her consent, and it's her choice. And we know this because the Prophet Muhammad obviously ordered this, but we know there's a quite interesting case study, not case study, really a narration rather, of a case where a woman came up to the Prophet Muhammad to seek redress. And she said, "My father forced me to get married to my husband." And so the Prophet said, told her that he offered to annul that marriage. He said he could annul this marriage because obviously people should not be forced into marriage. She said, "Well, no, I actually like the guy, but as a principle, I want people to know that you can't force people into marriage." And so that was the case. So women cannot be forced into marriage against their will, and they have obviously the right to choose, like anyone else has the right to choose. We also see that women have the right to dignity and respect in marriage. And I want to quote a narration. So a person approached the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and asked, what do you command us with regards to our wives? So what do you command us to do with regards to our wives? How should we treat our wives? So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, give them food from what you have for yourself, clothe them by which you clothe yourself, and do not beat them and do not insult them. This is what the Prophet said. Not even insulting them. Now I know that in kind of Western society, everyone knows that domestic violence is wrong, but there's a big debate as to kind of non-physical domestic violence. How much insulting of your partner becomes non-physical domestic violence? How much times does a woman have to call her husband an idiot before it, which is perhaps quite ubiquitous, but how much times, at what point does it become domestic violence, and how much times does a man call his wife a B word that it becomes a type of domestic violence? And there's a big debate as to this. Well, Islam solved this debate. It's the first word you utter is wrong. That's the boundary. You can't insult. It's not, well, you can say it maybe 6 times a day, but no more than 6. No. You can't say it at all, ever. No disparaging remarks, no disrespectful and hurtful words, no insults. The Prophet Muhammad made this very clear. And as regards to other matters, it was the man was kind of asking that what is fair treatment in terms of if I have to provide for my wife, giving her clothing. Of course, if someone might say, well, clothing could be interpreted as a sack with 5 holes in it. And there you go, I've provided you clothing, I've done my rights. No, the Prophet Muhammad said it has to be of the same level, the food and the clothing at the same level as the man. Not the exact same clothing, of course, but it has to be the same quality as a minimum. He can't give her less quality of clothing than he enjoys himself. So this was kind of clear guidance. We also see that women have the right to the time of their husband and also to intimacy from their husband and satisfaction with intimacy with their husband. Now, the thing is this, in Western society, it's kind of viewed as an anathema for an individual to be beholden in intimacy or physically to another individual. Because we're all individuals and we should not be beholden to anyone else. We just focus on ourselves, and only if purely selfishly that we desire to do something, then that's the only consideration that matters. Well, this is not how society works. It's not how civilization works. It's not actually how humans even work. We're social creatures, but we depend on each other. We need each other. And sometimes your loved one might not like doing something for you, or you might not like doing something for them. But because you love them and you care for them, you do it. Now, I want to make a point that these are kind of rights and laws and restrictions and obligations. But if people truly embodied compassion and mercy and kindness, you don't need these laws, in a way. I mean, they give you guidance in a way, and they're required because people do need to know the obligations that they're under. But people, if they were truly kind and truly compassionate, they wouldn't need to be told that their wife has a right over their time and intimacy. They would give it. And in a way, sometimes you could say that the law is not for the righteous, but for the unrighteous. Those who break the law, who have a tendency or want to break this law, not live by these laws. That's what the laws are for. They're guidance for those who don't want to be righteous, who don't want to be good, who don't want to be kind and compassionate. Because surely, as with Muslims, we believe it's within our fitrah, our innate nature, to want to be good, to be satisfied when we're being kind to others. And in a way, this is not, again, a set of rules and regulations that should be followed like it's very cold and unfeeling. In a way, as I said, if you were already embodied the spirit of compassion that Islam teaches, you wouldn't need to be told to spend time with your wife. You do it anyway. But for those who fail in it and say, well, it's not a problem, then you have to invoke these rules and say, well, it is a problem because your Creator says that your wife has rights over you and you can't just ignore her like she's a rag to be thrown away. You have to actually think about her feelings. So this is how Islam, the rights that Islam gives women, and how Islam characterizes marriage is not one of a hierarchical structure of power or dominance, one being the dominator or one being the submissive person. No. Here's how we believe God described marriage for mankind. He says, and among his signs is this, that he created you for you wives from amongst yourselves, that you may find repose in them, and he's put between you affection and mercy. Verily, indeed, these are signs for people who reflect. So, the relationship between a husband and wife is not one of domination or submission, it's one of affection and mercy. That is the relationship between the husband and the wife in a marriage. That is the defining basis for marriage, not one of subservience and rulership. So this is the kind of rights that Islam brought to women 1400 years ago in pagan Arabia. And in pagan Arabia, there wasn't no such thing as a constitution. People didn't have rights. There was culture, but generally speaking, if you were a woman and you didn't have a powerful father or brother, your husband could abuse you at will and whim, and no one's going to come give you any justice. There wasn't any court system to give you justice, nor if there was a court system would they even care so much, because there was no enshrined laws protecting this. So unless you had a brother and father who loved you so much that would threaten your husband to treat you well, you couldn't get that justice in pagan Arabia. But the Prophet Muhammad brought it in. And I finish up with another point, which is that 1400 years ago, Islam gave women, you could say, the right to vote, and vote for political leaders. And how this came in is that when the Prophet Muhammad was seeking the Pledge of Allegiance from the Muslims in order to become the recognized leader of the city, the first Muslim city-state of Medina, previously called Yathrib, he sought the Pledge of Allegiance not just from the males of the tribe, but also from the females. And previously, amongst the Arabian tribes and culture, you wouldn't need they wouldn't involve women in discussions of who should be the chief, or how a chief becomes valid or not, or a legitimate ruler. Women were not really involved in this. But the Prophet Muhammad required that in order for any ruler to be validated, for any ruler to become legitimate, women also have to participate in validating the ruler, not just the males. So he took the Pledge of Allegiance from both men, and he requested it from women too, before he could become the legitimate, recognized ruler of Medina. And this is followed through in many different Islamic contexts throughout 1400 years. We didn't have to wait for the suffragettes to start burning things down and blowing things up, or those suffragists, which were the main peaceful movement, which were the ones who successfully got the women the right to vote. The suffragettes were just a fringe group at the time, and we tend to focus on them, but actually it was the suffragists who were the ones who won the universal suffrage in the UK. Just a point of trivia. I'm a horrific pedant, so please forgive me. I like details. Attention to detail is my thing. Other aspects, now kind of the more bigger ticket ones, and I suppose we can't skirt around this because this is unfortunately in the news all the time, so I'm going to deal with the news items that you commonly hear, and I'll kind of deal with them as briefly as possible. But what I will say is this: in the Q&A coming up, I do hope that you challenge what I say, you approach what I say critically. The reason why people have misconceptions is because they listen to people without criticizing them, without questioning them, without checking for themselves. So I'd be hypocritical if I asked you to say disbelieve what everyone else is saying, but believe me. I want you to approach it consistently. So everything I say, demand references, look it up for yourself, do the background reading yourself, please, because that's how you destroy myths ultimately, is research. So, let's get into it. So you often see in the news and media, they talk about the problem of female genital mutilation, and they usually always connect it with Muslims. So they say, in these Muslim communities, there's female genital mutilation, it's a practice that is connected to Islam or Muslims. You'll see this kind of portrayal, even though many media outlets won't necessarily say it, but they'll keep connecting it to Muslims in the same article. Journalists have a number of ways to make you think things without saying it explicitly. And so that's a common trope. But of course, those in the far right and others will just say it, and they'll say it in a way that say, well, I'm going to be honest about things. I'll say what we're all thinking, which is it's Islam that is causing FGM. And they'll say that because the media, they've read it in the media in an implied way. And so for them, they just think maybe the media is too cowardly to say it, because the media made me think this, but it said it in an implied manner, so I'm going to say it in an explicit manner. That's why the far right often think that what they say is just speaking, being brave to say what we're all thinking. That's why they think that, is because the media has made them think that plant these seeds in their mind in an implied way. And so that's where this arises from, unfortunately. However, female genital mutilation, or more specifically clitorectomy, is not an Islamic practice. It's not commanded by Islam in any way, shape or form. In fact, we have one narration where Prophet Muhammad was approached by someone who did do clitorectomies, and he told them not to do those. He told them not to do this. We have these narrations. So it has nothing to do with Islam. But what you'll find is, it has everything to do with very ancient culture. More specifically, if you look at where FGM occurs, it occurs generally in the Upper Nile Delta in East Africa, where it's an ancient Egyptian practice that dates back 3,000 years. Prophet Muhammad wasn't around 3,000 years ago, so I don't think he can take the blame for this practice, which both Christian, animist, and Muslim inhabitants of that region are doing. And it tends not to be in the cities so much, but in the rural areas where this tradition survives. But FGM, is it a problem in Muslim majority Morocco, or Algeria, or Turkey, or Iraq? I heard that there are some areas in the north, the Kurdish areas, that they might practice this, but amongst the southern areas, the central areas, none. Iran, Pakistan maybe, or the biggest Muslim country in the world, or the biggest population. Indonesia, Malaysia, any FGM occurring there? None. It's just strange he seems to be linked to or only a few geographic locations, mostly connected to a recognized ancient Egyptian practice. But Muslims get blamed for this. And it's just like culture affects Muslims in other places. So you know that in Islam it's obligatory for dowry to be paid from the man to the woman, and yet, for example, in Pakistan, obviously, and Muslims in India, obviously, which are influenced by neighboring culture, you'll see that it is culture for the woman's family to pay a gift to the man's family, even though Islam, that's literally the opposite what Islam says. Where are they getting that from? Is it an interpretation of Islam? No, it's regional culture that's influencing them. What about the big T word, terrorism, which always gets connected to Islam, always in a very unfortunate, consistent manner? Well, the thing is this: when people talk about terrorism, people tend to have limited memory of history and limited memory of different societies. So let's see. So the Middle East has been invaded by a number of Western countries over the years. Britain, for example, has invaded Iraq 5 times over the last 100 years. I often make the joke that Britain has invaded Iraq so many times they should have a reward card. Next one's free. And yet, of course, what we encounter is that, and I'm approaching this from a criminologist's perspective. A criminologist is someone who studies the causes of crime. A criminologist's job is not to justify crime. If a criminologist says crime is happening in this area because of poverty, the criminologist is not saying crime should happen because of poverty. The criminologist is merely pointing out that there's a causal relationship. So we need to approach this subject in a similar manner as criminologists to look at causal relationships. So we see that, yes, in the Middle East there's internecine warfare, there's fighting, there's militias, there are people who are death squads, doing death squads, and we see that this also in the milieu of this, there is American invasions, and prior to that, British invasions and French invasions of the Middle East, going back 100 years. But if we look at somewhere else, like South America, in the 20th century, when you also had a lot of American invasions, we see exactly the same phenomena. Death squads, mass killings, assassinations, bombings, terrorism. In South America, are the South Americans following an interpretation of Islam? Are they following a medieval understanding of the Quran? No. And we see it everywhere. We see the same circumstances. We see terrorism arise as a tactic that is used by various groups and peoples in their milieus. And a lot of this terrorism is actually directly even caused. So, for example, by some Western powers. For example, the Nicaraguan Contras. So they were funded and supplied by the CIA. Now, the CIA didn't just give weapons; they also gave instruction manuals about how to be a good insurgent. including assassinations, bombings, killings. And they wanted to, and the CIA also suggested that to create martyrs, in order to help create martyrs in the insurgent community, that the insurgents will select members of their own group to kill and then claim the government did it and then make them as martyrs, which the Nicaraguan Contras said, that's going too far. The Nicaraguan Contras told the CIA that they're going too far in their suggestions. But this is something that is no mystery. Has anyone here studied South American history? No South American historical, or anyone history students of any kind? Do people study history here? Is that, or is it just related to the extraction, distribution of oil? Is that I see a lot of practical subjects. People take a lot of subjects which are very practical in this part of camp, I've noticed. So, all right. So what we see is that in like circumstances, we see the same scenarios arising. Even in cases where you think the causes are things that people are sympathetic to, such as the ANC's liberation against apartheid in South Africa. Right? The ANC's liberation against apartheid in South Africa, we saw that there was the militant faction of the ANC called the Umkhonto Msizwe, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, which is called Spirit of the Nation, again under Nelson Mandela's let's say control, perpetrated terror attacks against cafes, shopping malls, beaches, against civilian targets, fighting against apartheid. Now, no one's going to say that being against racism is a cause of terrorism, or being for equality of all citizens is a cause of terrorism, or liberty is a cause of terrorism. No one's going to argue this. But we saw that a group that was motivated by these desires committed acts of terrorism because they believed or they perceived that they were being oppressed. Now, I want to kind of state the Islamic perspective on the issue of terrorism, and it's I mean, unfortunately, I have to say that I have to state this because it's not so obvious in the mass media and in certain leaders of states south of the Canadian border with overactive Twitter accounts. Doesn't seem to be obvious to them. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ expressly and explicitly forbade the targeting of civilians and non-combatants in warfare. He forbade the killing of women and children. Explicitly, he forbade the killing of the elderly. And we have so many rules and regulations of warfare, including up until the point that if you're in a battle with an enemy and the person drops the weapon and turns around and runs, you can't fight, you can't kill them. You can't kill them. You don't fight them, you don't chase them. If they drop their weapons and turn around, you don't gun them down. Unlike what the US Army did when Saddam Hussein's army was retreating from Kuwait along a highway, they called the Highway of Death, and then the Americans found them as they were running away and just gunned them all down up. Like a massacre, or when they were all just fleeing on a highway. So America doesn't show that mercy, but the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ orders it, that if someone's running away from you, that stops fighting you, is running away, that's when you stop fighting. You don't chase them and kill them. We also see that the Quran says that fight those who fight you, but do not transgress the limits of God. God does not love the transgressors. So in the Quran, and this is the kind of the Quranic kind of rule for warfare, which is you fight those who are fighting you, but don't transgress the limits. Don't go over the limits of God. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's fine. These verses of the Quran, and I have many narrations of Prophet Muhammad which I can give you references to, but for the purpose of time, I don't want to reiterate all of them. But you can come see me afterwards, and I can give you all these references in detail, or I can get the MSA to kind of, if you give them your email address, I'll give them their references and you read it for yourself, because don't just take my word for it. I want you to read it for yourself and check those references for yourself. So you might be thinking, okay, this seems well and good, but then why are these terrorists of a ostensibly Muslim persuasion, why are they committing acts of terrorism if terrorism goes against their religion? How do you explain this? Well, I think that the only way I can really explain this is to give you a verbatim quotes from none other than Osama bin Laden. And please don't, when someone tells you how did this lecture go, don't be the first thing you tell them is, yeah, the guy talked about Osama bin Laden. Not really, doesn't sound right. Talk about other things first, then ease them into that. Alright. So there was an Al Jazeera interview that occurred on October the 21st, 2001. So there's an Al Jazeera interview, and you can find the transcript of this in a book by a scholar, Bruce Lawrence, called Osama bin Laden, Statements to the World, or Messages to the World. So the Statements of Osama bin Laden by Bruce Lawrence. But again, I'll make the references available for you to check it for yourself, to just do the background. So I want to read you the interview because I think you need to hear the verbatim word yourself. So the interview says, the interviewer asked him, how can you justify targeting non-combatants, civilians and so on and so forth, when the Prophet Muhammad forbade this? So how can you justify this? And here's what he says. He referred to the Muslim scholars. He said, they say that the killing of innocents is wrong and invalid. And for proof, they say that the Prophet forbade the killing of children and women. And that is true. So Osama bin Laden saying, yeah, and that's true. It is valid and has been laid down by the Prophet in an authentic narration. But this forbidding of killing children and innocents is not set in stone. That's what he said. So if the disbelievers were to kill our children and women, then we should not feel ashamed to do the same to them, mainly to deter them from trying to kill our children and women again. So his argument is not an Islamic argument. He's not saying the Quran tells me that I have to kill disbelievers wherever I find them, which is not in the Quran, by the way. You might hear that trope a lot as well, that it says kill disbelievers. No, it doesn't. But he's not arguing. He's making an argument merely that what the West does to us, we should do back to the West. That's his argument. His argument is not an Islamic interpretation, and so on. And when George Bush argued that, so when it was argued, he spoke to an ABC reporter in May 1998, and he was asked about, why do you target civilians, and why don't you differentiate between civilians and military targets? His response was, America has not been known to differentiate between the military and the civilians, or between men and women, or adults and children. Those who threw atomic bombs and used the weapons of mass destruction against Nagasaki and Hiroshima were the Americans. And then he argues, can the bombs differentiate between military and women and infants and children? America has no religion that can deter her from exterminating whole peoples. The position against Muslims in Palestine is despicable and disgraceful. Then he says America has no shame. We believe that the worst thieves in the world today and the worst terrorists are the Americans. Nothing could stop you except perhaps retaliation in kind. So his argument, and the reason why I wanted you to listen to all this, is so here that his arguments are not religious. He's not saying the Quran tells him to kill disbelievers just because they're disbelievers. And I will point out some other counterfactuals. One of the ways you can know that something is wrong is because it doesn't make sense when you think of other things. There's contradictions. You see, the argument that you'll hear from many Western politicians, unfortunately, is that the terrorists hate our way of life, and they hate our democracy, and they hate our drinking alcohol, and are sending our children to education, or women to education, so all these old tropes they use. And that this is the reason why they target us, it's the reason why they are attacking us. However, if you simply consider the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of Muslims who live in South America, and many Muslims are also living in South Africa, in the same proportion that there are Muslims in the UK. So Muslims in the UK are about 4 to 5% of the population. Muslims in South Africa, roughly the same. The country of South Africa. In Suriname, in South America, there's 14% of the population is Muslim. In France, it's 9%. So there's more populations per unit measurement in Suriname, in South America, than there is in France. So I want to ask you, the audience, a question. Because the argument is that the problem is there's a medieval interpretation of Islam that is causing certain Muslims to commit acts of terrorism. This is the argument, this is the trope that's produced. Not foreign policy, they say. I say, alright, how many terror attacks have occurred in the entire continent of South America? And Muslims don't only live in Suriname. Or in South Africa, perpetrated by Muslims against their non-Muslim neighbours. How many attacks throughout the whole history of these areas where Muslims have been living? How many attacks? Does anyone have? You, sir? A big fat zero. Oh, so what? So South Americans aren't clubbing and having parties in Rio de Janeiro and sending their daughters to school. They're not doing that over there to not be targeted? Or just America? Just France and England? What about, I could take some Western countries. What about Switzerland and the Republic of Ireland? Again, Muslims, sizable populations of Muslims live there. In Switzerland, they even banned minarets because they were worried about Muslim immigration, which Europe seems to have a history of being worried about its minorities going back 100 and so years. So they were worried about Muslim immigration, and they said, well, we don't want to ban manifestations of Islam, so they banned minarets. But how many terror attacks have occurred in Switzerland and Republic of Ireland done by Muslims? And when I mention Ireland, I have to say done by Muslims, because there were terror attacks done by not Muslims. But how many terror attacks have occurred in these Western countries with sizable Muslim populations in Switzerland and the Republic of Ireland? Can anyone give me a number? 0. How strange is it? It's weird, isn't it? That it's a big coincidence, surely, that all the countries that have neutral foreign policies or don't interfere militarily in the Middle East seem not to be affected by terrorism. Maybe they have like a little magic shield, or that they're wearing the Harry Potter cloak of invisibility that can't be seen but by terrorists. Now, I want to make it very clear. We're approaching this as criminologists, not as justifications. We're talking about cause and effect. We're not talking about justification. It's very important, because as Muslims, we believe that Islam and the commandments of God are set in stone. Our disagreement with Osama bin Laden is that we are fundamentalists. We believe that the fundamentals of Islam are not compromisable and are set in stone. Whereas Osama bin Laden thinks you can change it when he views it to be pragmatic, when he views it to be convenient. And indeed, if there was any verse of the Quran that is ever brought up, he does bring up the one verse of the Quran. He says, fight them as they fight you. But he leaves off the end, which says, but do not transgress the limits of God. He leaves that bit out. He just says, fight them as they fight you. So his argument is not to copy the Prophet Muhammad, not to copy the commandments of the Quran. His argument is that Muslims should be copying the militant nations within the West. And what examples does he bring? Hiroshima, Nagasaki, World War II, when Winston Churchill, which is viewed by some in England to be Britain's greatest Brit, according to some, I think it was some kind of a poll of British public opinion, Britain's greatest Brit, the guy who ordered the strategic bombing of Germany. And you thought, oh, strategic bombing, that like bombing tanks and military. No, it's a euphemism. It means bombing urban centres and civilian populations, which have no military value. 2, as Churchill said, demoralize the enemy to prevent them from, to stop them from fighting us, or to end the war, to make them surrender. And including in his bombing of cities, and obviously American bombers as well as British bombers did this, was the city of Dresden that mostly had women and children because most of the men are out. And they didn't just bomb them with normal bombs, they used incendiary bombs, fire bombs. They cooked to death, or burnt to death, because people went to shelters, and in the shelters, the fire bombs turned it into ovens. They cooked to death, or burnt to death, 30,000, mostly women and children, in the name of the war effort, in the name of the glory of British Empire and what have you, and American, the Woodrow Wilson policy of aggressive American foreign policy around the world. Although, to be fair, Woodrow Wilson didn't invent aggressive foreign policy of America, just asked the Hawaiians and the Filipinos about, America was experimenting with it the previous century, and then they just said that it's time for us to come out fully into the world now as Britain is declining as a new top dog. So this is really the circumstance. Osama bin Laden cites Winston Churchill, cites Hiroshima and Nagasaki as his model, not the Prophet Muhammad. And it's very clear that you know this. And the same with this more modern offshoot of Osama bin Laden's ideology, which is ISIS, as everyone talks about. And whenever you hear ISIS apologists discussing why they should do their terrorism, including attacking civilians, and they say it's permissible to attack civilians, which is what we would consider to be an egregious breach of Islamic belief, they always cite foreign policy, and they say the West attacks us, we should attack them. That's their argument. You'll hear this argument recycled again and again and again. And the only verses of the Quran that terrorists use, or the narration of the Prophet Muhammad, are more the more general verses, which say that fight against the unjust, or fight against oppression, very general stuff. That's the verses they cite. They don't cite any verse that gives them specific license to just kill people who are non-Muslim just because they're non-Muslim, or to kill non-combatants, because you won't find those verses in the Quran. You will not find those verses in the Quran at all whatsoever. And just to finish off, George Bush explained that when I mentioned early on, he said that they fight us because of our freedom. And someone actually responded to this on a Al Jazeera videotape broadcast. Was broadcast on the 29th of October 2004. And his response to George Bush was this: Bush's claim is that we hate freedom. Let him tell us why we do not strike Sweden, for example. Your security is in your own hands. Each and every state that does not tamper with our security will have automatically assured its own security. So here's his argument. He's not here to destroy, he didn't say he wants to destroy the West. And he's not arguing that he wants to kill all non-Muslims just because they're non-Muslim. His argument is it's Western foreign policy, and that if you stop attacking the Muslim world, he won't attack you, and just like he won't attack Sweden, because Sweden wasn't at that point anyway interfering in the Muslim world. So as I said, I want to make this absolutely clear, because as I said, whenever any Muslim talks about this touchy subject, unfortunately sometimes they'll argue that whenever they argue about foreign policy as a cause, merely pointing to it, because we all want to stop terrorism, we want to end it, and the only way you can end it is by honestly discussing the causes and trying to, if I could press a button that would immediately handcuff every person that wants to be a terrorist in the world, I'd do it. But because I don't have this magic button, I have to resort to trying to stop the causes of it. What causes them to be radicalized into terrorism, which is militant foreign policy. Because I don't want to see people being blown up. I don't want to see people being killed, innocent people being killed. As Muslims, we believe, as the Quran says, that if you kill one person unjustly, it's as if you killed all mankind. All of mankind. So if you save the life of one person, it's as if you save the life of the whole world. Forget all these Hollywood superhero movies of someone who's saving the whole world. You can save the whole world every day by donating blood, by helping your elderly neighbours make sure they're okay, and they haven't fallen down, they're not starving to death in their houses because no one checks up on them. These things, you can save mankind, people kind, sorry Trudeau, every day by doing something good. And I'll finish up with the last trope, and then I want to open up for question and answer, and I'll make this very brief. Generally, there's an argument that Muslims want to spread Sharia in the Western world. They want to spread Sharia throughout the land and impose upon everyone to wear niqabs and burqas and so on and so forth. Maybe even the guys as well. So this is the kind of tropes and arguments that you hear. And it's not the first time that you've heard these tropes and arguments have been made about a minority. In 1890s, up until 1890s to 1930s, as many studies have shown that throughout Europe, there was the idea, this anti-Semitic trope that Jews were trying to dominate Gentiles and spread their Jewish law and be on the top rung of society, ruling over the non-Jews, basically. And they were spreading and infiltrating Western society to try to undermine it and so on. We heard the exact same arguments. Everything from the argument of that they say that there are Muslim rape gangs in parts of, or no-go areas in parts of Europe. Again, there's no such thing as no-go areas in any parts of Europe. But there is the idea that Muslims who band together and specifically target non-Muslim free women because they don't respect them or what have you. This argument was made against Jews as well. And I'm not talking about Germany. But let's put Germany aside. I'm talking about Britain, I'm talking about France, I'm talking about Italy, Spain, and America. Does everyone know the famous car industrialist Henry Ford? Henry Ford, a famous innovator, car industrialist. He was a rabid anti-Semite. He wrote this series, unfortunately bestseller series called The International Jew. And it had this international conspiracy, he argued about the international conspiracy of Jews to take over the world and to control Goyim and Gentiles, and they are allowed to rape non-Jews and all this stuff. The same arguments you hear of Jews back then, it's being recycled now. And of course, not even Jews, also Catholics. In Protestant countries though, Catholics have also been accused of trying to take over Protestant countries. Even as early as 1950s, 1960s, there was claims that Catholic immigration into America is part of a secret papist plot to take over Protestant countries and establish Catholic canon law on the people. So the problem is that these tropes get reiterated. In England, it was even worse persecution against Catholics was quite harsh. They couldn't take public office, and every Catholic citizen of technically subject, the royal family. Everyone was all subject of the king or the queen. Every Catholic subject had to publicly disavow the Pope. Had to disavow the Pope. It's part of Catholic doctrine to believe the Pope is the preeminent bishop or Christ's vicar upon earth. You can't tell a Catholic to disavow part of their belief and still claim that you believe in freedom of belief. You can't do that. But that was part of the law in Britain until mid-19th century. So the mid-1800s. Anyway, so this is fallacious, and I'll simply prove this quite simply. In Islam, we believe that non-Muslims who live in a Muslim majority lands or under Islamic government, that non-Muslims are generally not under the Sharia. Why would we expect people to follow a law they don't believe in? Doesn't make any sense. Or how are you going to make a Christian righteous by preventing them eating pork when they think there's nothing wrong in eating pork? It becomes ridiculous. The whole point about Islam is that people embrace truth voluntarily. God gave us free will for a reason. The whole point of free will is that you have to voluntarily choose to be good for it to have any meaning. That's what this life is a test for all human beings, to show our true colours. But we can only show our true colours if we have the free will. And we see that the Prophet Muhammad, he gave treaties and agreements to Christians living under Muslim protection in his time. So he gave to the Christian town of Najran, he declared to the Christians there that Najran and its people enjoy protection from God and from the Prophet Muhammad for themselves, their religion, land and wealth. So the Christians of Najran enjoy protection for themselves, their religion, their land and their wealth. All these things are protected by God and the Prophet Muhammad. We also see that the Prophet Muhammad referred to, and non-Muslims become contract citizens in the Islamic government. And this is, I don't want to go too much in details, but the term dhimmi has been used by a lot of Islamophobic polemic. And they say dhimmi is a diminutive status for non-Muslims. That non-Muslims are second-class citizens throughout the entire history of Islamic government. No, actually not. Technically, non-Muslims are the only citizens in an Islamic government. Muslims are subjects. There's a difference. Well, technically you're all subjects of the Queen of England and not citizens of the Canadian state, but potato. In Islam, Muslims are beholden to the head of state, and the head of state is actually God. But the executor is a caliph who in practice administrates and looks after affairs. But Muslims, we are beholden to a lot more things than a citizen. So in essence, non-Muslims are not beholden to the Sharia. They were given autonomy in their own law courts. You had Christian law courts, you had Jewish law courts, you had courts administering Hindu affairs. You had even autonomous zones and regions. It was common to see in many cities, like in Damascus, there are still the historic Armenian quarter, and there was historic Jewish quarters. And these weren't areas which were ghettos where they were confined to. It was just an area of autonomy. I mean, there was no borders. You could go in and out as you pleased. But it was an area which was recognized that let them live together as they please. There was no argument saying these people aren't integrating. They're living in ghettos. They have to adopt Muslim values or caliphate values. None of that argument you hear today in nation states, which are less tolerant of different divergence. They argue it's against integration, it's against assimilation. People have to assimilate into the culture. People have to stop living in ghettos, they have to spread out and be dissolved like sugar in tea or something like this. None of that. If you wanted to live together with your co-religionists and you wanted to live and follow your own practices, Islam had a policy of non-interference. And the Prophet Muhammad gave such protections that he said, whoever has harmed a dhimmi has harmed me. Whoever has harmed a non-Muslim who lives in Islamic lands, it is as if they have harmed the Prophet Muhammad himself. Now, as Muslims, we wouldn't want a single hair on the head of the Prophet Muhammad to be harmed. We even don't like it when he's insulted. Yet the Prophet equated harming a non-Muslim living amongst Muslims as if we were harming him himself. He also said, surely whoever oppresses a non-Muslim citizen, the word is used as muwahid, whoever oppresses a non-Muslim citizen or imposes upon him more than he can afford and humiliates him or takes anything from him without his consent, I will challenge him on the day of judgment. So the Prophet Muhammad is warning Muslims with a very grave and strong threat, so to speak, that if any Muslim even humiliates a non-Muslim who is living amongst us in an Islamic government or Islamic lands, or imposes upon him anything more than he can bear, or takes anything from him without his consent, then on the day of judgment, the Prophet Muhammad himself will be asking God to punish you. On the day of judgment, the Prophet Muhammad himself will be asking God to punish you. That is scary for a Muslim to be told this. Very scary. So, my point is this. You saw things like in medieval Baghdad, medieval Iraq, there was records of these Muslim travelers. They were going through Iraq and they were seeing Christian towns with pig farms and wineries in medieval Islamic Iraq and Syria and Morocco and all these places. You saw wherever there were Christians. They didn't always have to have pig farms, but pig farms, well, it's not the characteristic of a Christian area to have a pig farm. But I'm saying that Christians were not prohibited from eating pork, from drinking alcohol, which obviously is prohibited in Islam, because we believe that the intellect should always be preserved. That's the only thing that differentiates you from creatures and animals. So your inhibitions are required. But anyway, it's a different discussion. But basically is that Christians were not under the Sharia. So here's my point. If Muslims don't want to impose Sharia on non-Muslims who live in Muslim lands, how do we want to impose Sharia on non-Muslims in non-Muslim majority lands? Becomes ridiculous, the argument. So anyway, I think I've yapped on for long enough. But what I will say is that I hope you'll take a lot of what I said into consideration. But more importantly, I hope you'll take what I said critically, check it for yourself, verify what I've said. I will give your email to the MSA and I will kind of send out references so that you can find the references to what I said and more things that I didn't have time to say because it would go on forever if I did. And in the Q&A, I don't just want questions and answers, I also want contentions or challenges as well. Because as I said, there's no one else on this panel sharing with me to make that, so I'm going to have to rely on you to produce that. So all I can say is thanks for listening and I look forward to your questions. So, I'd like to invite questions, comments, or my personal favourite, contentions. Just disclosure, I prefer debates than lectures, which is why in England I do more debates than I do, I try to do more debates than I do lectures. People invite me for lectures though, but I want you to kind of say anything you want to say. So anything you've heard, even if you think it's controversial, it's better you say it and we can then discuss it, and so people could benefit from it, than rather you keeping it bored inside you and kind of not letting it see the light of day. So it's better. The only way we can deal with myths is by kind of exposing them into the cold, hard light of discussion. So please, questions, comments, or contentions, sister on the left there. Okay. So to kind of reiterate for those who didn't know, didn't hear the point being made. So the sister asked the first question, which was Islam obviously urges that we have kind of we fight for justice and we protect people's rights and we protect and look after people, people especially who might be being oppressed and might face issues. But some of their issues might concern practice of things that Islam might disagree with, and so how do we be their allies without compromising our own position? And the second point, if I understood it correctly, is it was kind of similar to the first, which was that how would Islam protect people's, let's say, rights to do particular things when it would outlaw it would outlaw like selling alcohol, for example. Well, okay, I'll deal with it in reverse order. In essence, Islam, the Sharia is for Muslims. So if you believe in the Sharia, you believe in God, you believe in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then the Sharia is our guidance and is meant to kind of help us to achieve enlightened and noble conduct and civilized decorum. And so, for example, the case of alcohol is banned for Muslims. So alcohol is considered to be, alcohol, there's no specific mention of alcohol. Technically, the word alcohol is an Arabic construction, because Muslims were the first to distill alcohol from wine and honey and make it a separate, pure substance, inadvertently inventing vodka in the process. Not what we intended. But the prohibition is against khamar, which is the Arabic word. It's the same as khimar, the word for head covering, which means anything that basically covers your mind or head and prevents you from using your capacity of intellect and to have your inhibitions present to regulate your conduct. So alcohol and any other type of drug that achieves that or does that is prohibited because we believe that the intellect must be preserved at all costs. That's what makes us different. And I often find it to be unfair that people sometimes are prosecuted for doing crimes that they literally don't remember the next day doing. And they would never do if they were in their right mind. And I think it's a bit of a contradiction that you allow alcohol and then you punish people for doing things when they drink alcohol. And then you say, well, they should be responsible and only drink only as much as they can before becoming drunk. But their capacity to understand or measure them becoming drunk is becoming inhibited by the same substance they're imbibing. So how can they accurately deal with that? And if anyone says to me, but I drink alcohol, I don't usually get drunk. But have you been drunk at least once in your life? Have you done anything that you might have regretted at least once? Yes. And maybe for most of you it's not going to be that bad, but there are many other people which are going to be doing things that they do regret and they might not like. But I'm not telling those people who don't believe in Islam to quit alcohol. I'm merely suggesting that there's an innate contradiction between allowing a substance that inhibits our intellects and yet you hold people accountable as if they were in full control of their intellect. That's the issue. However, the Sharia again only applies to Muslims. So Christians can drink alcohol if they believe it's allowed, and atheists and whomever can drink alcohol if they believe it's allowed. It's not for them. Just as long as they don't be, drunk and disorderly and start attacking Muslims in the streets or something like that in an Islamic government, then they're left to do their own practice amongst themselves. There's no issue with that. I actually discovered that you could say there's a bit of Sharia in English law, as maybe Canadian law too, is that you're not actually allowed to be publicly drunk in England. It's actually against the law in England. And no, that wasn't spread recently by some Islamic cleric forcing its way into the statutes. It's an old Victorian law that was there. And I spoke to a policeman about this. I said, I didn't know that it was prohibited to be drunk in public. Why don't you, arrest people for doing that? And then he said to me, well, if we did that, we'd have to arrest ourselves because we've all been there basically. So what they usually do is they'll arrest you if you are drunk and something else, drunk and disorderly, drunk and harassing people, drunk and fighting someone. Then you'll be arrested, and that will be a count on your sentence that you were drunk in public. So it's discretion by the police, but technically you're breaking the law if you do that. So with your second question, there's no real issue, I think, there. Islam always had a policy of non-interference, and this always links to your first question, which is, I'm assuming that when you're discussing, let's say in a Canadian context or in a Western context, you might be referring to LGBT community or First Nations are not really defined by practice; they're just defined by in ethnicity and origin and so on. But I'm assuming that you're referring to a whole plethora of practices. So, where can Muslims kind of fit in? Well, I would have to really explain the Islamic perspective towards what is called in the West homosexuality. People often think, and this is not a trope, which I didn't have time to mention because time is limited, but I'm going to be very quick. The Sharia doesn't have a word for a taxonomy of human sexual preference. There is no heterosexual bisexual, homosexual, pansexual, whatever, any kind of sexual. Or even asexual is also an orientation now. These words were really kind of brought up in the mid-19th century. And they initially were trying to describe types of mental pathologies which they were perceived to be pathologies at that time. So they invented this word, the sociologists and others and people were studying it, and then it became popularized to the point that humans started to be categorized in the West by their sexual preference, which, as far as Islam is concerned, is irrelevant. I mean, people's desires are not the basis to categorize and label people by. You know, so it's like going into I know Timmy's and saying I'm a was it old-fashioned donut-ophile, and someone says no, I'm a glazed donut-ophile, and we have separate identities now, and we have to form separate communities, or something like this, right? It's trivial in that sense. So why would you divide people by their preferences? In essence, the irony is when the label was created to differentiate, that was when people began to discriminate. Do you understand? So as far as the Sharia is concerned, everyone's just human, and we don't see through that kind of lens. It doesn't exist. What happened is, and I'm gonna have to kind of point this out to Muslims as well, stop using the word homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, pansexual, asexual. Stop using those terms yourselves. They are Victorian imports into the Muslim world. Many ignorant rulings have been issued using Victorian era terms which were brought into our own education system by British, and then Muslims adopted it. And then you had the idea of, then you had these people claiming that homosexuality is prohibited or homosexuality is sinful. And when a Westerner hears that, what they're hearing is you're saying that a person who has a desire is innately sinful, and a person who has a desire that they didn't control is innately going to hell, irrespective of what they do or who they are. That's what they hear when you say homosexuality is prohibited. And it causes so much confusion. So let's stick to the Sharia terms. There is no term for homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, asexual, whatever, pansexual. There is no such terms in the Sharia. The Sharia only looks at activities and actions. And in terms of our theology, or in terms of from a perspective, yes, we do believe that sex outside marriage or extramarital affairs are prohibited. These are aspects that human beings are prohibited by God from doing, and they're sinful practices. But desires are not an issue. We're not like certain maybe other religions where desire might be a sin in itself. There's a narration by the Prophet Muhammad who said that God has forgiven us the whispering of our hearts to ourselves. So whatever the whispers of our hearts, God does not kind of hold us to account for these things. So basically, someone who has a desire that they didn't control, and let's be honest, every human being, from the Islamic perspective, by Islamic criteria, has at some point in their life some desire which is contrary to the laws of Islam, what we would call sinful desires. And so everyone has it. So if you're going to condemn people for having sinful desires, you're going to condemn every single human being on the face of this earth. So I want to reject 19th century human sexual taxonomies. It's not Islamic at all. And in essence, while we might not approve of the practices done by, well, we don't approve of drinking alcohol, we don't approve of people eating pork, but it doesn't mean that we can't defend Christians if they're being persecuted or being killed or being attacked because of their religion or their faith. We can defend these people. Just because we disagree with the practices doesn't mean we can't defend people from being physically attacked. We want to prevent that from happening. We want to protect them, their physical integrity, and we want to stop them from being discriminated against, not getting offered jobs and things like that, where everyone should have a fair right, a fair meritocratic right to access. So you don't have to condone someone's lifestyle choices in order to want the best for them and to want to protect their physical integrity and ensure that they're treated fairly. You don't have to agree with what they do. And there's a confusion in this. Sometimes people think tolerance is full acceptance of what someone else does. That's not tolerance. That actually becomes intolerance, because everyone who disagrees will then be condemned as the outcast. Which is why you're having this major right-wing, left-wing clash in many Western countries where no one knows. I mean, everyone might be intolerant of some position, and then everyone's trying to force each other into their own position, claiming it's tolerance and it's just creating confusion. So I'm going to be the third way here and just say, let's agree to disagree, and let's agree to protect each other. And it doesn't mean that you can't exhort each other. Look, feel free to try to convert me to Christianity if you want. Feel free to criticize Islam if you want. I'm all up for that. In fact, I couldn't do debates if you didn't do that, so feel free. That's not a problem. It's not intolerance. If you think that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was not being truthful, I don't find that to be insulting. If that's your belief, it's your belief. But if someone says all Muslims must die, or all Muslims must get kicked out, or Islam is an existential threat to our way of life and our people, and we must extract it in the harshest means possible, then I might draw the line and say, well, that might be going a bit too far, a bit too genocidal-y type direction. Don't like it. That, that's not really expression of free speech. That's an expression of something else. So I hope that answers your question. We don't have to agree to want what's best for each other, and we don't have to agree to want to protect each other from harm. Any other questions, comments, or contentions? You, sir, in the middle.
Just to reiterate what you said at one point, that you say that there is absolutely no verse in the Quran which justifies if someone were to attack you, not attack you back.
Sorry, there's no verse in the Quran that says, well, sorry?
That says if someone were to attack you, you have no right to attack them back.
No, there is a verse in the Quran that said that fight those who fight you. That does exist. But it also says, if it continues, but do not transgress the limits of God. God does not like the transgressors. So it means that, as Islamic classical scholars have discussed this, it means that if someone's fighting you, and you're fighting them as like one nation between nation, or state between state, or government between government, whatever, there's a fight. But if they are attacking and killing your civilians, you're not allowed to retaliate in like manner and kill their civilians, even if they are targeting your civilians. You limit it just to retaliation against military. So if they march into your borders with a big army, you can defend yourself against that army. But it doesn't mean that you go into their borders and start burning down their villages and killing their people. That you can't do that. That's what it means. We're not pacifists, but we believe in what you might call just war. Just war. Practice. Your point. You, sir, in the front. Okay, so it's a good point. So the argument, that's part of the trope that you might hear that people say, Islam believes that women are worth half that of a man. And to bring that up, they'll say, as evidence, they'll say, women get half inheritance compared to their brothers. And I say, how is that fair? How is that equal? And so on and so forth. Well, I'll kind of highlight this. There are in political science and philosophy, there are different understandings of equality. Right? Is it equal outcomes? Is it absolute equality under law? How do we manage equality? How do you understand what is equal and what is equality? There's a verse in the Quran that says regarding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, or God says in the Quran, I do not waste the deed of any doer amongst you, male or female. The one of you is as the other. So fundamentally, the one of you is as the other. Male and female, the one of you is as the other. So in the Quran, God tells us that He views men and women to be equal. They are equal in His sight, equal in His eyes. But the family structure is different. And the human species has a type of sexual dimorphism that's quite clear. It doesn't mean, some doesn't say that women have less intellect than men, or more intellect than men, or whatever. That's not the discussion. The discussion is that the human species appears to have two genders which are physically different. Not like swans. Swans where it's virtually the same. They look physically the same. They're different. So in this circumstance, the Islamic Sharia has given that men are the protectors and maintainers of women. In essence, you could even argue, and men's rights activists might even criticize Islam by saying, it seems that men are subservient to women because men's role is only defined by being maintainers and protectors of women. So our role is in relation to women. You could, maybe men's rights activists might even argue that. I heard there's a few in Edmonton as well. Actually, I didn't know they were living just there. I think there's some popular YouTubers who are men's rights activists. I might go there and debate them maybe. So in Islam, because a woman can own her own property, she gets given a marriage gift, and she doesn't have to spend her property, her money on anything. She doesn't have to spend it on anything. She keeps it, can do whatever she wants with it. But in Islam, in a marriage, the man must spend that money on his wife, from his money. So in essence, if men were given the exact same inheritance as women, the men's rights activists could probably argue that it's unfair on men, because not only do men not get any special money to help them, but they have to have an additional burden that women don't do. They have to actually spend money on women. Whereas in Islam, because men have to look after women, rather because the husband has to look after women, in essence, the extra money he gets from his inheritance is money that would go to women anyway. It's for him, so he can spend it on his wife, basically. So in essence, it balances out, and there's an absolute equality that's preserved. What I mean by that is, I often give the example in England of this. I'm not sure about in Canada. In Canada, I think you are allowed firearms generally, not as much as I don't know if you're allowed the same kinds of firearms as America. You guys don't have any mass shootings here, but I don't know. But yet you still have firearms allowed, which is interesting, isn't it? So it's just a side. I often wondered what's different about America and Canada, that you both have firearms, but America seems to have a propensity for people to do mass shootings almost every other day. Anyway, but in England, firearms are prohibited. People can't own it. You can't own firearms in England, and in most European countries, normal citizens cannot own assault rifles and AK-47, which you can buy in America, strangely. Anyway, but police people who are policemen, and police women and police people, they can have pistols and guns and so on. In England, they can, although mostly they don't, but specialized units can have it. So, why doesn't anybody say, that's not fair, if the citizens can't have guns, why are police allowed guns? Why wouldn't that be a bad argument? Can anyone answer? You?
Because they have a role.
They have a role. What role?
Or a job. They have those weapons because, like they have a certain role. They have a job, responsibility.
They have responsibility. Okay. So in essence, if you give extra to one, that person must have extra burden than everyone else. So to what you give, I don't want to quote that often cited trite Spider-Man quotation, but with great power comes something about responsibility. Yeah. So basically, if you give something extra, that person has to have additional burden, and so that overall equality is maintained. So men are given extra inheritance relative to their sisters, but they have additional burden. And in essence, if you look at most inheritances, they wouldn't be enough to actually cover the lifelong costs of looking after a family. So that's how the Sharia organizes it. Of course, and I'm going to say this, that these are situations, but there are actually a number of other situations where the woman gets more inheritance than the man. So Islam doesn't just have a black and white one size fits all. It has exceptions, and many depending on circumstance and so on and so forth. So there are many cases, in fact, where actually women get more inheritance than men, depending on the circumstance. These are details which I can supply via the emails and things, and if you want further information, go through. You, sister.
I was just gonna save that information about the number of cases that it says here in Islamic law, women inherit less than men in 4 scenarios, similar to men in 10 scenarios, and more than men in 14 scenarios.
Yeah, so just to reiterate what the sister said, that men inherit more than women in 4 scenarios, the same amount in, was it 10 scenarios, and women inherit more than men in 14 scenarios. So again, I can supply that information, probably from the same source as well, but I can supply that information via the MSA, so please give them your email address, because I've now made a claim, and I haven't given you references to back it up, so I'm going to give the references to the MSA, and they're going to send it to you, because again, I don't want you just to believe what I'm saying. You know, just say, oh, it's not believe it's because some bloke from with a British accent, so he must be right. Told me this, yeah? So there you go. Any other questions, comments, or contentions? Oh, on this side? Okay, you in the corner.
Yeah, I think you might want to explain why is there such family roles in Islamic Sharia? Because a lot of people here, they don't believe that each gender should have a specific role in marriage. They believe each one should do their own thing. Maybe agree on certain roles. So in Islam we have specific roles. Maybe you can explain why we have those roles.
Okay, so the gentleman asked a good question. So why is there gender roles? And I suppose implied in that is a question as to what do we mean by gender roles as well. Now, in Western society, the idea of individualism is that the individual is not beholden to any higher thing than itself. So not society, culture, religion, or God. So individualism views any idea of an obligation to be anathema to itself. That if individuals are obliged to each other, this is somehow an anathema, even though civilization depends on people having mutual reciprocity. Without that, you don't have civilization. And if no one taught you language, you would never learn it yourself. There's even debates as to where language even came from. Islam, the Quran says that Adam ﷺ was taught the names of things. We believe that God was the first teacher of language to mankind. And interestingly enough, this Western philosopher called Thomas Hobbes argued the same, that God taught Adam the language, even though this doesn't occur in the Bible. The Bible doesn't say that. Where did you get that from? Interestingly, it's just hypothesis. I just found that interesting. Many people said that he had access to Oriental literature. But anyway, but as sociologists and psychologists will note and tell you that they find children in the wild who've been raised by wolves and monkeys and what have you, and they don't speak any language. And once you're past a certain age, which I think is around the 14, 15 mark, if you haven't learned language, you'll never learn it. Due to neuroplasticity, basically, I'm oversimplifying this, but let's just say your brain solidifies, becomes hard to mold, shall we say. That's a simplification there, but anyway. So we need people to tell us the very language we speak. And if you think you're an individual, well, let's put it this way: people don't know if there's anything beyond what you've been acculturated with, what your parents taught you, or your DNA and environmental happenstance. Beyond that, they don't know what is actually special, specifically about you. Is called the problem of authenticity. Right. So what actually makes a human different or special, other than just the component parts, which they had no control over? There's a big debate about that, especially with materialists. But I digress. So with gender roles, we make a simple argument. In other species and creatures throughout the earth, whenever you see sexual dimorphism, which is basically the difference, the physical differences or differences between the sexes in any particular animal species, you'll see there are specialized roles. So no one's going to go to ant colonies and say ant colonies are oppressing the individual ant, because what if a worker ant doesn't want to be a worker ant and wants to be a soldier ant, even though it doesn't have the big mandibles required to be a soldier ant? You know? Or what if a soldier ant wants to be a queen ant, even though it can't reproduce? Right? Like, no one's going to argue for ant rights. Also is. But that being said, it doesn't mean that because humans aren't all black and white or fit into one mold, that there is no leeway. I often say that the exceptions resolve themselves. So in a way, there's a standard template, and then there's exceptions. So the standard template is that men, due to the power of testosterone, are going to be bigger, stronger, and taller than women, which is why they still retain gender segregation in Olympics and in sports. Interesting that I want to see an ice hockey game with men and women playing equally side by side. Why won't they allow that? Which will also bring another question as to, if you're playing ice hockey, is it allowed to basically be forceful if the other person's a woman, right? I've seen some of the Canadian ice hockey games. They get pretty rowdy, actually. I was like, this can't be Canadians. Canadians are usually very polite and kind, and what's going on? It's like they vent it out in that one game. I don't know. So the reason why they'll still institute gender segregation in sports is because there's no way around sexual dimorphism within human beings, and if they didn't allow it, it would be a disproportionate amount of women would not be in the top the top 10 or top 20 athletes competing for various medals. So in order to allow women to have access, they have to be kept separate in the separate categories. So whenever people talk about gender segregation, they say, it's a wrong thing, or say, we should get rid of it in your societies. I say, well, you first, basically. But that being said, so men are protecting and maintaining women working and can focus on careers and things. But it doesn't mean that, let's say, if a woman is an entrepreneur and women can be business owners, women can work in Islam. The Prophet's wife Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Khadija, and she was a businesswoman, very successful businesswoman, in fact. It doesn't mean that a woman might say, you know what, I want to be the one who makes money in the family, and I'm only going to find a guy who will accept this scenario, and I will not ask him to look after me. I will waive my rights. I will not demand him that he has to support me. That can work, that can happen in the Sharia. As long as it's consensual, agreed upon, as long as she chooses not to waive her rights, then that can be the arrangement, basically. But if the man is only sinful if the wife demands those rights and he refuses to give it. Then the man becomes sinful. But if she chooses to waive the rights, then the exceptions resolve themselves. So if you think that Islam doesn't pigeonhole people, it gives you like a template which it encourages, because most humans will fit into that template. Most humans will be happy and content and feel a sense of satisfaction in that template. But the exceptions are there, and they usually resolve themselves. So it's not one size fits all. Yusa, you're back.
When it comes to the topic of misconceptions, in a lot of scenarios, misconceptions are used to create hate and division, especially say in North America where Muslims are a minority. You know, sometimes they make it pictured as if it's allowed for a Muslim to just walk around with a sword decapitating every Muslim side. That's perfectly allowed, but that's not the case. Point being, when you go back to the Middle East, countries like Kuwait, Bahrain, Pakistan, you have mostly Muslim demographics, but you have divisions in terms of the different sects of Islam. And a lot of times there are misconceptions, again, which are propagated to breed hate and division. The issue comes by when you don't realize that you think you know about the other sect misconceptions. So as a Muslim, how can you know that what you think you know doesn't verify what you think you realize somehow the other side? Or B, how can you your own side of it, where if somebody you come across, they think you know about you, but you know it's wrong. So in what way can you sort of facilitate that to ensure that, for the sake of unity, for the sake of clear out misconceptions, how can you take those steps as a Muslim?
Okay, so the gentleman asked the question, which is, how do we get rid of misconceptions, even amongst Muslims in the Muslim world, towards each other, as well as generally? I want to bring up a point. Now, you've probably seen me be a little harsh on Western foreign policy and certain British empires and America and so on and so forth, and various populist demagogues that have a penchant for social media. But I want to be honest about this, because we have some home truths. I think those who are the biggest misrepresentatives of Islam will remain, unfortunately, the current state of the Muslim world. I will say this unapologetically, the biggest. I know I have a go at the West, but I have to be objective about this as well. And there's a reason for this. Long story short, the Islamic civilization around about the 16th century attained a kind of equilibrium or plateau, as most successful ones do. Once it reaches that, it began to stagnate and decline. Happened to the Chinese civilization as well. They reached a great plateau. They reached an economic equilibrium where everything had to be the same as it is for it to work. They made it very efficient, but the slightest changes that happen, and it starts to wobble and then begins to slowly degrade over time. So it's a sociological fact, the rise and fall of nations and so on and so forth. I often say the worst thing that ever happened to Muslims was success. And if an alien was to visit the world in the 16th century and looked at the world, he thought it would be dominated by an international system that was based on or influenced by Islam or by multi-Islamic civilization. If they came to the 16th century, you'd see the powerful Ottomans, the Persians, and the Mughals dominating the central trade routes. But what changed that dynamic a bit was Europe were great students of us, at least only in the material sciences, and they discovered the New World, which had lots and lots of wealth, which gave them an advantage over the Muslim world. And then suddenly they had lots of gold, and then they would basically come to the Muslim lands and trade our resources for gold, and then sell us back dirt cheap industrially produced, the beginnings of industrially produced metalworks and things like that. And Muslims just thought, why do I need to buy from my own local factories when I could just basically buy cheap foreign-made goods? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And then industry started to go down in the Muslim world, and Muslims depending on trade and the trade routes, and of course when Europe bypassed that to go to the or went around the Africa to the East Indies, then the economic situation impact caused big problems in the Muslim world. But also that over so many hundreds of years, Muslims took their doctrines uncritically and began to just believe in a kind of superficial shell of Islam. So they knew about prayer, they knew about one God, but the depth and understanding the details, it started to be like lip service, you know. I mean, I would argue the same is happening in the West as well. Like just yesterday, I asked a simple question to the audience, and there was many people of different backgrounds, not just Muslims there. I asked, what's the justification for free speech? Why is free speech? Why should free speech be important, or why is it important? And people said, is it because you have to express yourself? I said, yeah, but why do you need to express yourself? Right? I mean, why do you have to speak unfiltered? Or, I mean, we all speak with a filter, right? So and people couldn't answer the justification for it. Is it because we're in a democracy? Yeah, but what does that mean? Like, why? Just because you're in a democracy, which I don't, well, the Greeks wouldn't think so. But anyway, just because you're in a democracy doesn't. Why is free speech important? Like, why your representatives don't ask your opinion when they make policies? So why do you need to speak, right? So they couldn't answer it, and I had to remind people the first basis for free speech, according to the Enlightenment founding fathers, you could say, of Western political philosophy, is the pursuit of truth. The purpose of free speech. I had to remind people about this. They forgot, and this happened in the Muslim world, that we touted the concepts in a very superficial way, but we forgot the justifications and the ideas and the details and things. So we had intellectual stagnation to the point that the West had more technology than us, and then they decided, oh, we can invade them now. And then they basically started to invade. And then that's where the next thing that hit us, which was colonialism, and our education system was changed and gutted and filleted, and made us even more disconnected. So religious education was not funded or even prohibited, and Western philosophy was taught instead. And Muslims forgot what the Sharia says about a whole number of things, because if you were a person, and in the Muslim world today, we still have this perception that if you are a scholar of religion, you're ignorant about worldly affairs, because the funding for schools were only for schools built by the West on material subjects and Western philosophy, political philosophy, and the religious schools were cut the funding. They cut the funding because they took over the state. The state was supplying money to these schools. They just cut the funding because they now control the state. So Muslims became ignorant about our own religion, and then you see over time all those old cultural practices that Islam has successfully pushed out to the periphery of Islamic civilization begun to come back in again from the hinterlands and the wastelands, the nomads and others. They came in and brought these things back, where we thought we had got rid of them for centuries. And this is the situation in the Muslim world today. Our governments are not chosen by ourselves. Our governments, virtually, you could point to any government and I can show you when it was instituted by either the British Empire or the French. Saudi Arabia, Britain. It's the Saudi royal family. It gave them guns, weapons, and money, and used even them to bully other governments or other new governments to do what the British said. Like the Hashemites of Jordan and Iraq and so on and so forth, until they obeyed. So the Saudis were very good enforcers for the British when World War I, for example, and they owed the British everything. There was even a narration, again in the references, I'll include it, where the founder of the Saudi state thanked Sir Percy Cox, the British kind of governor, for his position, and he said, "I owe everything to you. So without you, I would not be this, and I will do what you say. I will respect what you tell me to do." It's on record of saying this. So, and again, references on the emails. So anyway, I have to say this history lesson. I know it's a bit of a long-winded thing, because that's the thing on everybody's minds. Why is the Muslim world in the state it is? And I'm not here to defend the Muslim world currently in its current state. I'm not here to defend the practice of Muslims. I'm here to talk about Islam and the presence of Islam when Islam was practiced and implemented in the classical times up until the arrival of European invasion powers. So, and I'll just give you one example, just one little example to illustrate my point. I made some general comments, but I want to give an example. You've probably all heard about the Pakistani blasphemy law, where they say there's a law in Pakistan, it's very unfair. It's a law that basically prosecutes people for blaspheming or insulting religion, or for making claims about religion that other people can find insulting. So even if you didn't intend to insult, if someone's offended, you could be prosecuted, actually, a blasphemy law. Although some people might say that there are some modern laws in the Western society that are also similar, that if you offend people, you might also be prosecuted. But religion is still fair game. This law, where do you think this law comes from? Where do you think it's derived from? Can anyone give me an answer? Is it from the Bible? Is it from the Bhagavad Gita? Where do you think this comes from? British colonial law. Got it in one. You're a very knowledgeable audience. I like to spend some. I usually like to spend some time, hearing different guesses from different people. In some way, it's quite fun. All right. You've taken the wind out of my sails with the punchline. All right. So yes, it started life as Ordinance 295 of the Indian Penal Code, and it was drafted by the infamous British colonial governor Lord Macaulay. And it was also revised by Sir Barnes Peacock, Chief Justice of the Calcutta Supreme Court, and it became law in India, in colonial India, in 1860. In fact, the first victims of this law were actually Muslims. So there was a case in 1887, 2 Muslim men were convicted of religious insult and sacrilege and profanity because they killed 2 cows in Shahjahanpur, which was argued that the Hindus would be offended by this, and therefore these people had profaned the Hindu religion, and they were convicted. 2 Muslim guys were convicted. It was only repealed, that case was only repealed because it was on a technicality. It was argued that because a cow is a living thing, and the law only protects sacred objects, that the objects we interpret it to only mean inanimate things. So because the cow was not inanimate, it could not be called a sacred object. That was the technicality of the law. But that was the only thing that got these people off. So when India and Pakistan were created, they both took the law. India has that part of that law as Pakistan does. It's all virtually identical to the Pakistani law. India has the same law because it comes from the same source. Not from the Sharia, not from the Quran, not from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, but from Lord Macaulay, a British colonial governor. I mean, yes, there were some slight amendments made in the Pakistani constitution over time, or in the penal code, but these things were, if you look at it, it's just extra emphasis. Like, for example, they said insulting the Quran or profaning the Quran is to be included as a crime. But that already came under profaning sacred objects anyway. Or insulting the Prophet Muhammad, yeah, but that already came under insulting religious personalities. So in essence, the Pakistani version of more Islamicizing that law was just to mention examples. That's really what it did. But the formulation of the law would do it anyway, would cover that anyway. And the irony is, in Pakistan, much more Muslims are prosecuted for blasphemy than non-Muslims are. Oh, and when it is argued, they say, oh, but surely in the Pakistan system you said that people can be executed for committing blasphemy. So I ask a very simple question. In the entire history of Pakistan, how many people have been executed by the state for blasphemy or religious insult or profanity against religion? Can anyone give me an answer? A big fat 0. Yeah. But people you don't hear this. Now, this is not justify anything. It's just to show that there's an overblown kind of perception of mass killings of blasphemers and in the Muslim world. And what they'll do is they'll say, look, there was a case where this mob killed this one Christian guy, so this means that this is widespread. And I say, well, I can point to you where a guy stabbed, a few cases in England where Muslims were stabbed outside a mosque, one was run over by a van. Does that mean that that's the policy of the British state? No. But it happens. What about in Quebec? The Quebec mosque shooting? Could I go to Pakistan and tell the Pakistanis, in the West, Muslims are being massacred left, right and centre. Here's one of the evidence, the Quebec shooting. Does it represent how Muslims are commonly treated in Canada? No. But if you haven't been to Canada, or you haven't been to America, and you didn't know any better, you might be fooled into thinking that, if I keep repeating that story enough, and I keep repeating that idea enough, and that's what's happened concerning situations in the Muslim world. Even the cases when you might even hear of sorry, I don't want to digress, but even the cases of when they claim honor killings, honor killings is part of Islam and what have you. they always ignore the fact that killings for quote-unquote honor occur in India amongst Hindus and Sikhs. And even in England, there was a case recently that a Sikh father killed his daughter because he felt she dishonored the family by wearing Western clothing. What interpretation of Islam was that Sikh guy following? It wasn't Islam, was it? It's got nothing to do with Islam. And it's murder. In Islam, it's murder. You can't murder your child merely because they're disobedient or they are sinful on the issues of wearing clothing or what have you. That's wrong. You can't do that in Islam. So it's not from Islam. Of course, in the West, they have a different word for honor killings when done in the West. So people who kill each other out of feeling that they've been disrespected and dishonored, they call it crimes of passion. So if a guy goes into his house and finds his wife with another man and kills his wife, they call it crime of passion, and they mitigate the sentence. It's not first-degree murder, it's either second or third-degree murder, depending on... So they even mitigate the sentence. So imagine how I could, if this occurred in the Muslim world, imagine how I could spin it in the West. You say Islam allows men to kill women. Look what happened to prevent women from exercising their sexual autonomy. Look what happened. It mitigates the sentence of a man who killed his wife because he found her committing adultery. I could spin that in that way and make you feel that this is what happens in the Muslim world, but when it happens in the West, it's explainable as, this is just what we call a crime of passion. It occurs, and it doesn't carry the same sentence as first-degree murder. So if someone had a criticism, did your point to make? Yeah. So a woman was to have to have sex outside marriage. The punishment in Islam first and foremost, just jumping the topic a little bit, but first and foremost, there's two aspects to the Sharia. One aspect is the political application, and another aspect is, you could say, the theological ramifications of things. So it's a sin to have sex outside marriage. But if a person does it in a society, in the privacy of their own home, the Sharia doesn't have a jurisdiction, the political application of it doesn't have jurisdiction into the privacy of your own home. In a way, you could argue that its effect is more symbolic, because the punishment, and it's not just for women, it's for men as well. There's no only women, it's everybody, basically. No one is allowed to have sex outside marriage in Islam. But when you apply in the Sharia, and it is corporal punishment, it's not being locked in cages, which you call prison in the West, which they deem to be more enlightened way to deal with prisoners, putting humans into human zoos. So it's corporal punishment, and they return to their families the same day. It's not. But to be guilty of it, you actually have to do it in public, which is really not going to happen, generally speaking. And especially in Canada in the winter, you'll die if you do it in public. So the weather is harsher than anything Sharia could come up with. So in essence, we know this because there was a case. I'm going to give you a citation now. So one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad was Umar. You could say disciples, if you want to use. We say companions, disciples, whatever you want to use. And so after the Prophet Muhammad passed away, Umar became the second caliph of Islam, the political leader of the Muslim community. So he'd like to patrol the streets himself in person, because he was always worried that people might be starving or be poor, and he wouldn't know about it, and God would hold him accountable for it. So he used to personally patrol the streets. And there are many cases where he'd find a woman who was looking after her kids but didn't have any food, and was pretending that she was making food because the kids were so hungry, and he felt so sorry about this and so guilty that he took food from the treasury and make sure that she never had to want again. So he used to patrol the streets. So in one particular case, he was patrolling the streets, and he heard some kind of, let's say, strange noises from someone's house. So he kind of peered over the wall, and he saw, let's say, a middle-aged kind of guy, or an elderly kind of guy, entertaining a woman of ill repute, perhaps, let's put it this way, and drinking wine. So Caliph Umar, who is the magistrate, obviously, he said, shame upon you, how dare you do this, you deserve punishment for this. And what did the man say back to Caliph Umar? Shame on you for violating my privacy. And so in essence, Umar's response to this was, in essence, okay, I'll drop it if you drop it. Right? So you're right. Yes, the law is appears to be very strict because the sacredness of marriage, the sacredness of family, the fact that people can engage in intimacy, but intimacy requires responsibility, and that's why marriage is sacrosanct. Marriage is basically intimacy with responsibility. That's all it is. So that's why there's protections, but it's only in practice. It's symbolic because it couldn't prosecute anybody if they did it in their own home, where it generally occurs. So unless you actually come out into the public, you can't be prosecuted for it. And most people don't realize is that Islam protects privacy. We don't wiretap your phones and check your emails and things like that, like apparently civilized countries do. So there's that. Anyway, so going back to the issue of the Pakistan thing, just very quickly, was the law the Islamic law is different from the formulation by Lord Macaulay in that the formulation by Lord Macaulay prosecutes people who are offended by people who exercise their beliefs or express their opinions, and people who are merely expressing their sincerely held beliefs are prosecuted in Pakistan, which is certainly how it's applied in India as well. Muslims also get prosecuted for offending Hindus and Hindu customs, certainly under this nationalist Hindu, ultra-nationalist Hindu government, unfortunately, that's occurring. Ultra-nationalist Hindus, not as distinct from Hindus, who are not ultra-nationalist like the BJP party. So just to make a distinction there. So they're not one and the same. Much, although the BJP would like to think so. So, Islam looks at intent. In essence, if you are expressing your opinions, if you want to criticize Islam, if you want to believe that the Prophet Muhammad and you want to express that you believe the Prophet Muhammad is a liar, then as a non-Muslim, you have the freedom to do so. Why? Because, of course, you're going to believe that if you don't believe in Islam. If a Christian believed that Prophet Muhammad wasn't a liar, he'd be Muslim. Right? And we see these discussions in I've read this in as far back as 10th century books where they discuss the specific ideas of, okay, so if Christians are saying this, what should be our policy towards this if they're going out in public and saying things about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it was said, and the opinion that it came to in this jurisprudential text, and I will give you quotes, again references, was that of course they're going to believe that because they have the protection of being non-Muslim. The same protection to be non-Muslim and have their religion in a Muslim land is the same protection that allows them to express those same opinions. The very fact that they are non-Muslim means they already think that the Prophet Muhammad was not being truthful, for example. So of course, expressing that is not insult, it's just them expressing their opinions. And they have the right to do so. And we saw, and I always bring this example up, I don't know if anyone's Catholic here, but there's a very famous Catholic saint called Saint John of Damascus. Very famous Catholic saint. Why was he called Saint John of Damascus? It was because he lived in Islamic Syria, in Damascus, and he published the very first Christian invectives against Islam in, I think it was 8th or 9th century Syria. And he described it as a heresy, and he wrote that Islam was a heresy born of the devil. And he published that book in Islamic Syria, and nothing happened to him at all. Now, I think some later on European clerics argued that, he must have been punished. One of his hands was cut. The Muslims cut one of his hands for writing against Prophet Muhammad. But then, of course, when they encountered the stories that mention that, he died with both hands, it was then argued, God miraculously grew back the hand the Muslims had cut. Right? Which obviously, you can make of that what you wish. So nothing happened to him, and of course, you have books which we have still the extant titles of books published by atheists, by Jews, by Christians, by Zoroastrians, criticizing Islam, and they're in Arabic. Why were they in Arabic? Well, because they were published during medieval Islamic times in Islamic societies. Nothing happened to them, and what you did see happen was Muslim scholars would then write books refuting those books, and they would have a back and forth, much like you have academic discourse today as well. There's back and forth refutations. Ibn Hazm al Andalusi from my part of the world, Iberia, Spain, and Portugal. There is Portugal as well, not just Spain. Everyone says, just Spain, yeah? No, Portugal as well. Let's not forget that part that does exist. Some people have said, Portugal, where's that? Anyway. Ibn Hazm al Andalusi was famous because he actually was right in the he was famous for being right in the front lines of back and forth literary debates with Jews, Christians, and atheists, that which showed they could publish freely in the Muslim world without fear of being persecuted or prosecuted for blasphemy. But you might not get that in countries like in Pakistan, using a colonial British law and a misinterpretation of that. And more than that, Muslims get it worse, because there was just one case. I'll just give you one case, and I'm going to end my response to this question. There was one Muslim sect believes that the Prophet Muhammad never celebrated his birthday, therefore we shouldn't celebrate his birthday. Another group believes that it might not be obligatory to celebrate the Prophet's birthday, but if you want to do it, and it's nice to do it, we like to do it. Okay. So they put up a poster calling to an event celebrating the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, and the other group didn't like it and just tore down the poster. So what they did is they accused the two men that did that of insulting the Prophet Muhammad, and they got convicted and sent to jail. Something that the Sharia would never prosecute for, but it got used and abused between these different rival sects, or groups, or whatever you want to call them, against each other. And that is only because we use the colonial British formulation of the law, and we don't use the Sharia formulation of the law, where they would not be convicted. And many non-Muslims would also not be convicted under those laws. So that's why I say that these problems are not from Islam. But I blame Muslims for keeping those laws and for keeping our government structures and our systems and for propping them up, because they couldn't exist unless we went along with them. So I know I've been maybe a tad bit harsh on the West today, but on certain Western countries anyway. Ireland's really nice. I love Ireland. But I put the biggest blame for misrepresentation upon the Muslims, because we are ignorant of our own religion, our own Sharia, our own law, which is why we let our governments get away with a lot of that and more. Even if they are propped up by Western backers, the soldiers are from our own people. The soldiers that protect and guard the gates of these rulers are our own people. And it's because of our ignorance of the rights that Sharia gives to Muslims and non-Muslims that a lot of these misconceptions are created in the first place. And that would be my answer to your question. I think I've just been given the symbol that it's the end of the event, or I'm going to have my head chopped off. Either one. But okay, what I will say is this: is that I mentioned a lot of claims and a lot of references, and so I've got the audio. I'm going to kind of listen back and remind myself. I'm going to make all these available to the MSA. So please give your email address to the MSA and check out these references for yourself. Also do your own background reading as well, and check out these references and see them in their context as well. I want you to see it for yourself, because ultimately the only one who's truly going to destroy misconceptions and myths is going to be yourself and your own critical faculties. So all I can say is thank you for listening, and I hope to be back again here maybe next year if I haven't abused my welcome. Thank you.